The old relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation, is over.
Imagine the iconic Ambassador Bridge, that vital artery linking Windsor, Ontario, to Detroit, Michigan, now a standstill of idled semi-trucks stretching for miles, engines humming in futile frustration. Dust from the delay kicks up like a desert storm, while overhead, the faint glow of factory lights flickers on, signaling another night shift idled by uncertainty. Cut to Prime Minister Mark Carney's voice, steady but laced with steel, echoing from a March 27, 2025 address. The old relationship we had with the United States is over. What started as a brash American bid to reclaim manufacturing glory has cleaved through the heart of North American unity, transforming steadfast allies into wary adversaries overnight. President Donald Trump's 25% tariffs on Canadian autos and parts, slamming into effect on April 3, 2025, weren't just economic policy. They were a declaration of economic war on the continent's most intertwined supply chains. And Canada? It's hitting back with a fury that's reshaping borders, economies, and even loyalties. Today, we're diving into this deepening chasm, the origins of the tariffs, the thunderous backlash, the staggering costs on both sides, and the fragile threads of diplomacy holding it all from unraveling completely. Is this the true end of an era, or merely the opening salvo in a brutal renegotiation? To grasp the gravity, we must trace the fault lines back to their genesis in January 2025. The story of US-Canada auto trade reads like a saga of shared prosperity, one forged in the fires of post-war ambition and tempered by decades of deals designed to defy distance. It all kicked off with the 1965 Auto Pact, a visionary agreement that erased tariffs on vehicles and parts, catapulting Ontario into a manufacturing powerhouse and binding the two nations in a web of mutual dependence. Fast forward to 1994's NAFTA, which expanded that harmony across North America, and then to Trump's own 2020 renegotiation of the USMCA, a pact that enshrined duty-free access for compliant goods, vehicles with at least 75% North American content, parts crossing borders up to 8 times in a single assembly. By 2024, Canada was pumping $35.6 billion in auto exports south, supplying a fifth of all U.S. imports, from engines forged in Windsor to transmissions tuned in Ingersoll. Factories weren't just neighbors, they were symbiotic, with Michigan plants starving without Ontario aluminum and Ontario lines grinding to a halt without Detroit designs. It was a model of integration, a North American engine revving at full throttle. But Trump's second inauguration on January 20, 2025, threw a wrench into the works. In his address, he vowed an immediate overhaul of our trade system to protect American workers, framing tariffs not as barriers, but as beautiful tools to enrich our citizens. By February 1, executive orders under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act slapped 25% duties on nearly all Canadian and Mexican goods, with a lighter 10% on energy like Canadian oil, tied explicitly to demands for tighter borders against fentanyl and migrants. March 4 saw steel and aluminum tariffs reinstated at 50%, hitting Canada's primary suppliers hardest. Then came the hammer. On March 26, a presidential proclamation targeted autos directly, imposing 25% on vehicles from April 3rd and parts by May 3rd, with threats of escalation to 35%. Exemptions for USMCA-compliant items softened the blow for U.S. assemblers, but the message was clear. Trump's "America First" meant reshoring at any cost. "We want to make our own cars," he declared from the Oval Office, flanked by blueprints of gleaming Michigan plants. Yet beneath the bravado lurked a gamble. Would allies bend or break? Canada chose neither. It roared back. The Canadian response wasn't a whisper. It was a thunderclap, swift, symbolic, and searing. On April 9, mere days after the auto tariffs landed, Ottawa fired back with matching 25% levies on U.S. vehicles and parts, projected to rake in $8 billion funds earmarked for worker retraining and business bailouts. Remissions shielded USMCA-compliant imports, mirroring Washington's exemptions. But the symbolism stung. No more one-way streets. Ontario Premier Doug Ford captured the raw edge, warning of chaos and uncertainty for American families as retaliatory duties rippled through Detroit's veins. The crescendo hit on March 27, when Carney, fresh from leading his Liberals to a minority victory, addressed the nation from Parliament Hill. "This is the end of an era," he proclaimed, his economists' precision cutting like a blade. The 1965 Pact, he lamented, had birthed 60 years of close cooperation, partnership, job growth, and prosperity, now shattered unless a new comprehensive approach emerged. Split-screen the moment, Carney's measured gravitas against Trump's truth social barrage, firing off threats of large-scale tariffs if Canada dared pivot elsewhere. Broader salvos followed. September 1 brought partial de-escalation, lifting most counters amid tentative talks, but steel, aluminum, and autos remained locked in levy limbo. Public fury fueled the fire. Boycotts surged, with cross-border flights plummeting 70%, Tim Hortons swapping U.S. coffee beans for domestic blends, and social media ablaze with eBuy Canadian pledges. One ex-user vented, $11 paint now costs 46 thanks, tariffs, echoing the sticker shock rage from Windsor welders to Calgary commuters. Carney's call to reimagine the sector crystallized it, a C2 billion diversification fund to lure EU and Asian buyers, scrapping rigid EV mandates for flexible incentives. It wasn't surrender, it was reinvention, born of betrayal. Words like these don't just echo, they erode trust, brick by diplomatic brick. Yet rhetoric alone can't measure the wreckage. The economic fallout paints a portrait of mutual mutilation, a supply chain not bent but broken. For Canada, the tariffs struck like a seismic fault. Vehicle exports to the U.S. cratered 23% in April 2025 alone, plunging the sector into recession and idling 1,000+ jobs at GM's Oshawa plant. Manufacturing output dipped 5.4% by mid-year, with Oxford Economics forecasting a CR1 billion hit to auto production by 2029 if duties persist. 6,000 jobs vaporized, exports 10% below baseline. The loonie wobbled toward 0.65 USD. Inflation ticked to 2.7%, and BMO warned of unemployment spiking to 8%. But resilience flickered. YTD exports to the US fell just 2%, cushioned by $5 billion in new deals with Europe and Asia, as global automakers of Canada decried the uncompetitiveness, but pivoted to Tokyo and Berlin. Visualize it starkly. Pre-tariff 2024 saw $35.6 billion flowing south. 2025's year-to-date, a bloodied $27.5 billion, a 23% hemorrhage that no Band-Aid could staunch. On the US in-Taipei side, the mirror cracked wider. Households braced for a $1,300 average tax hike baked into car prices, with Edmunds pegging new vehicles at $48,118 and used at $24,402 affordability's breaking point. Automakers howled. Ford and GM, hooked on Canadian parts for 40% of their builds, lobbied furiously for rebates. 3.75% of MSRP refunded on U.S. assembled rides through 2026. Retaliation boomeranged, shaving 0.2% off GDP and zapping $223 billion in exports, while Indiana plants ramped up only to stall on aluminum shortages. X lit up with American frustration. "Tariffs are a tax on us," one Detroiter posted, as prices for a simple fender jumped 25%. The integration's curse became clear. Parts ping-ponging 7 times across the border meant every levy was self-inflicted, a rupture costing the continent $1 trillion in bilateral trade at risk. No winners here, just two giants bleeding from the same wound. If economics exposed the fractures, politics poured acid into them, turning a trade spat into a soul-deep schism. Carney's maximum pressure vow, hinting at C$155 billion in potential retaliation, clashed with Trump's jabs, dubbing Canada the 51st state and mocking its sovereignty as an artificial line drawn with a ruler. U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra fanned the flames, branding Canadians anti-American on X, while his barbs only amplified the chorus. Public sentiment soured overnight. Polls showed favorable views of the U.S. plummeting from 73% to 23%, with 63% taking Trump's threats very seriously. In Toronto rage rooms, effigies of Trump shattered under hockey sticks, Vancouver diners ditched Budweiser for Molson, and U.S. travel bookings nosedived 30% by July. A boycott wave cresting on X, with elbows up trending nationwide. Canada, long the polite neighbor, eyed new horizons, BRICS overtures, EU pacts, even Buy Canadian mandates, pausing EV targets to shield domestic steel. Echoes rippled globally. EU and Japan mulled counters. Mexico's Claudia Sheinbaum thundered, "No tariffs under USMCA," and Berlin decried the duties as bad for business, worse for consumers. This wasn't mere haggling. It was a betrayal narrative, eroding the goodwill that once defined the world's longest undefended border. With talks frozen and tempers flaring, the question loomed, could fists unclench before the continent cracked? As October 6, 2025 dawns with Carney jetting to D.C. for a high-stakes summit, the standoff teeters on a knife's edge. Focus sharpens on sector-specific relief, autos and steel foremost. But Trump insists the U.S. needs nothing from Canada, his barbs undimmed even as USMCA renewal consultations grind forward. Optimists eye a steel truce redux, tariffs easing to 12% in a nod to shared vulnerabilities. Pessimists foresee a dragged-out war eroding $1 trillion in trade, with Canada's diversification accelerating apace. Carney's blueprint? Elbows down for talks, but only after bolstering homegrown resilience. Scrap EV mandates for tariff leverage, funnel billions into Asian assembly lines. Yet the scars linger. 90 billion fled Canadian markets southward in 2025 alone, a vote of no confidence in the old order. This rift isn't abstract. It's families forgoing Florida vacations, welders eyeing Berlin gigs, and executives redrawing maps where America First redraws alliances. Will tariffs temper into a tougher, fairer pact, forging North American steel anew? Or will they fracture the continent's backbone, leaving two nations richer in resentment than resolve? One thing's certain, the bridge across the Detroit River hums quieter now, a silent sentinel to harmony's high cost. Stay vigilant. The next handshake could heal or hasten the divide.